So to better understand sacral dysfunction, we're going to start by discussing our normal or expected sacral motions to add some context so we can better understand it. So in terms of the first type of motion we're going to talk about is going to be postural motion. So in normal posture, so related to normal forward bending or back bending or lumbar flexion or lumbar extension, we would expect the sacrum to flex and extend either forward or backwards, so anteriorly or posteriorly on a transverse axis. So with lumbar flexion, we would expect with that lumbar spine flexing forward for relatively the sacrum to rotate posteriorly. So with lumbar flexion, we would expect sacral extension. With lumbar extension, we would expect also sacral flexion in tandem. The next type of motion we're going to talk about is respiratory motion. So when you breathe, or when human beings breathe, the sacrum is going to move also in flexion and extension, very similarly to postural motion, but the relationship of those motions is going to be a little bit different. So with inhalation, we'd expect the sacral base to move posteriorly, so extension with inhalation. And then with exhalation, we'd expect the sacral base to move anteriorly or into flexion with inhalation. So that's going to be extension with inhalation and flexion with exhalation, both of which occur on a transverse axis. The next type of motion we're going to talk about is dynamic motion. So during the gait cycle, oblique axes are engaged. So for example, when you step forward on your right side, you plant on your left side, and the force generated through you planting on your left side locks the left oblique axis, and as you step forward on your right hand side, your right sacral base is going to move anteriorly. So normally with stepping forward on the right side, you would end up with your sacrum rotating to the left on a left axis, so a left on left motion of the sacrum. When you then plant on your right side, you engage the right oblique axis, and then your sacrum is going to move or rotate to the right on a right oblique axis. The last type of motion, which is not as related here, and we'll discuss more in a future session, is inherent motion of the sacrum, as it's related to the relationship between the cranium and the sacrum and the dural attachments between. So with craniosacral flexion, we would expect the sacral base to move posteriorly, so into extension. And with craniosacral extension, we would expect the sacrum to move anteriorly, so into flexion. But to avoid any kind of confusion, we refer to sacral flexion and extension a little bit differently in this context. With an anterior sacral base or with rotation anteriorly of the sacrum, we would call that nutation, and with rotation posteriorly, we would call that counternutation. So with craniosacral flexion, we will find counternutation, and with craniosacral extension, we would find nutation. Now that we've talked about our normal motions of the sacrum, let's talk about some dysfunctions, and hopefully that helps to clarify what motions and expected findings we would have. So first example we're going to use is sacral torsions. So in sacral torsions, what we would find, and we're going to use a right on right sacral torsion as an example, we would expect the sacrum to rotate towards the right, so the front of the sacrum rotating to the right on a right axis. So rotation to the right on a right axis. We would also expect L5 to rotate in the opposite direction. So as the sacrum is rotating to the right on that right axis, we expect L5 to rotate to the left. So how is that going to correlate with our exam findings? On exam, we would expect for there to be a positive C deflection test on the left. We'd expect a deep sulcus on the left-hand side, a posterior iolate on the right, which would be engaging a right oblique axis. We would also expect L5 to be rotated to the left. We would expect also a lumbosacral spring test to be negative because we have an anterior sacral base. And we would also expect to have a sphinx test that would be negative as well for the same reason. Now talking about posterior type sacral torsions, we're going to use a right on left sacral torsion as an example. We would expect for the sacrum again to rotate to the right on a now left axis, and L5 we would expect to rotate to the left. So how would that relate to our exam findings? In this instance, because we have that left axis, left oblique axis, we would have a positive C deflection test on the right, a shallow sulcus on the right, an anterior ILA on the left. L5 would be rotated to the left. Our spring test would be positive, and our sphinx test would also be positive because we have a posterior sacral base. The next type of dysfunction we're going to talk about is similar to our torsions. It's our rotations. So in terms of our deep and shallow sulci and oblique axes, they're going to be very similar. The main difference is our rotation of L5 as related to the rotation of the sacrum. So for an example of a left on left sacral rotation, we would have a positive C deflection test on the right, a deep sulcus on the right as well, and we would have a left oblique axis and a posterior ILA on the left, suggesting that left rotation on that left axis, and our L5 would be rotating also to the left. For a right on left rotation, which is more of a posterior type rotation, we would have a C deflection test positive on the right, which would suggest our oblique axis is on the left-hand side. We'd have a shallow sulcus on the right, an anterior ILA on the left, and with our right rotation on that left axis, we would also have a rotation of L5 to the right for our right on left rotation. So the next somatic dysfunction we're going to talk about for the sacrum is bilateral dysfunctions. So we have two types of bilateral dysfunctions. There's bilateral sacral flexions and bilateral sacral extensions. So in this instance, we're expecting the sacrum to move either anteriorly or posteriorly on that same postural axis that we were talking about before, but you're going to have a restriction in motion in one direction or the other. So for bilateral sacral flexion, you'd expect the sacrum to rotate anteriorly, symmetrically, and for bilateral sacral extension, you'd expect the sacrum to rotate posteriorly, symmetrically. So what are the findings that we're going to have? For a bilateral sacral flexion, our C deflection test is going to be symmetric. It's not actually going to have any kind of laterality. It's going to be symmetric. But what we are going to find is we're going to find our sacral sulci are going to be bilaterally deep, and our ILAs are going to be bilaterally posterior. Our lumbosacral spring test is going to be negative, and our sphinx test is going to be also equivocal because nothing is going to change. Nothing was asymmetric to begin with, so nothing is going to change. For a bilateral sacral extension, we would expect, again, our C deflection test to be equivocal, so negative on both sides or symmetric. And we would expect our sacral sulci to be bilaterally shallow. We'd expect our ILAs to be bilaterally anterior. Our spring test in this instance is going to be positive, but our sphinx test is also going to be negative because there was no, or equivocal because there was no asymmetry to begin with. So with lumbar extension and sacral flexion, we're not going to really see any change in terms of symmetry. So the next sacral dysfunction we're going to talk about is sacral shear type dysfunctions. So the two types of dysfunctions we have are unilateral sacral flexions and unilateral sacral extensions. So I'm going to talk about a right unilateral sacral flexion for the sake of an example. So with a right unilateral sacral flexion, because the sacrum does not live on its own and always lives in the context of the innominate, what's happening is the sacrum is shearing anteriorly and inferiorly. As a result, what we're going to see is a deep sulcus on that side and a posterior ILA on that same side. We're not going to be really considering or engaging oblique axes. We don't really have normal flexion extension axes being engaged. Instead, what we're going to end up with is, in terms of our exam findings, we're going to end up with a seated flexion test that's going to be positive on the right, a deep sulcus that's going to be on the right, a posterior ILA on that right side, a spring test that's going to be negative, and a sphinx test that's going to be negative. In the case of a unilateral sacral extension, so we're going to use a right unilateral sacral extension as our example, we would expect very much the opposite. So the sacrum has, in the context of the innominate, sacrum has sheared posteriorly and superiorly. So it's shearing in this direction. As a result, we're going to have a positive seated flexion test on that right side. We're going to have a shallow sulcus on that side, an anterior ILA on that same side. In this instance, we're going to have a positive spring test and a positive sphinx test because we have a posterior sacral base on that side.